I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. A lot is happening in politics at the moment, north and south of the border. Later, we'll find out what's occurring in Holyrood with our Scotland correspondent as the SNP's Humza Yousaf brings to an end his coalition agreement with the Greens. And now it is the First Minister whose future could well be in jeopardy. But we start, as many of you will be ending your day, on the trains, or at least Labour's plans in government to get them working properly. The opposition says it will nationalise, renationalise, in fact, most passenger rail services within 5 years. Here's Shadow Transport Secretary Louise Haigh.
Labour will sweep away the broken model and bring private operators into public ownership as their contracts expire. We will establish Great British Railways, a single directing mind to control our railways in the passenger interest. Yes, we're keeping the name. I'm afraid I was overruled on calling it Rail Britannia.
Our deputy political editor is Sam Coates, and he joins us on the podcast. Sam, good to see you. Explain exactly what is Labour's plan, because, dear Lord, anyone who has used the railway network in the past 5-10 years will have tales of woe about their experience.
At the heart of Labour's plan is essentially a move to nationalise the railways. What's going on is that they are saying that every time one of the train franchises expires, they will allow the control of that to lapse into public ownership. Now, there are already a number of train operating services that are in public ownership, like South Eastern. But Labour, over, they think the next 5-year period will basically allow all of them to follow suit. And so all of the companies that currently run the railway, run those different lines, will lose control of them, and they will instead be brought under the control, as it were, of Great British Railways, an arm's length body which Labour says that it will set up on day one of a Labour government.
And presumably they have fully costed all of this, Sam, as it always becomes the mantra. How are they funding it?
Well, because they're not interrupting the contracts, they say that every time one of the lines contracts, one of the company's contracts lapse, there will be no fee, and therefore, effectively, there is no great down payment, there is no upfront cost. But the biggest question around all of this, Neil, is about cost in the medium to long term. And you've got to start by acknowledging that commuters, users of the railway are pretty unhappy. They're unhappy with the frequency of services, the quality of services, the number of trains, the type of trains. Generally, I think customer satisfaction levels are very low. And that's why, if you look at the polling, this policy of nationalisation is incredibly popular, and it's why Jeremy Corbyn had it and Keir Starmer's Labour have decided to inherit it. But the problem that privatisation undertaken by John Major, you remember in the early 90s, was meant to solve, is that so long as the railways are in public ownership, then if you want to improve the trains, if you want to buy more trains, if you want to upgrade the trains, modernise them, run more services, then all of that has to be done by basically finding money from the Treasury. But those funds are fiercely fought over. In effect, back pre the early 90s, the trains were in competition with health and education, other public services, for a slice of the sort of public spending pie. It's not clear to me that in 10, 15 years, there will be a greater appetite to prioritise trains, which are, after all, only used by a tiny section of the population, over health and education, for instance. And so the question is this going to solve the actual problems that commuters face, or is it just doing big structural reform, but it's unclear whether or not that's going to mean that people's experience changes?
Yeah, and look, there are lots of interesting details in this plan as outlined earlier by the Shadow Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh. For example, the fact that, whilst they will be nationalising in part, they will not be bringing into public ownership the rolling stock, the trains, the carriages, through what are known as ROSCOs, rolling stock companies. On top of that, best price guarantees, an immediate refund if your train is delayed. All of this sounds great, but the killer question is whether or not it's actually going to be cheaper.
One of the arguments that Labour is making is that they can see billions of pounds of efficiencies to be made. And on top of that, the one thing that won't need to happen, given that the railway companies will no longer exist, no longer run those services, that you won't need to pay money as dividends to shareholders of the train operating companies. I was at the event with Lou Haig this morning, and I said, OK, that's fair enough, but have you got an agreement from Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, that if you find a saving, by, for instance, not having to pay dividends, that it can be recycled into the railways? Have you ring-fenced all the benefits of any economy drive or any efficiency savings?
So we would hope that we would reinvest some of those savings. We've not got agreement that all of it would be. But the taxpayer, what we've got to remember, already subsidises the railways by over £4 billion a year. That level of subsidy has not changed since pre-COVID in the previous system. The taxpayer is already footing the bill for the railways in a very broken and inefficient model. Passengers are paying the price and the taxpayers are getting very poor value for money. These reforms will allow us to demonstrate that we can get better bang for our buck and deliver a better service for passengers as well.
So, yes, there'll be efficiencies. Yes, there will be more money going to the Treasury pot, but no guarantee that that then won't be snaffled away for things that Keir Starmer and his team think are of a greater priority than the railways themselves. And this goes to the heart of the issue. The thing that the Tories have alighted on, and it's an interesting argument, is why fund the railways to such an extent, given so few people effectively use it? I don't think that Rishi Sunak is a massive fan of trains. I don't think he wants to allocate a big section of the public spending pie to it. The question is, will a successor, even a Labour successor to Rishi Sunak, actually, when they're having to make hard choices between different government departments, think any different?
You squint, you look at plans like this, they do look very old Labour, particularly when you're bandying around words like nationalisation. You look at what Sir Keir Starmer has been trying to do with the party and the way in which it is trying to portray itself at the moment, that they don't want to bind themselves necessarily to a plan which looks just a little bit 20th century, perhaps.
I would depart from one sort of implied suggestion in your question, Neil, which is that this plan, which, was effectively a plan that you could find in Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto in 2019, is still in Labour's policy prospectus because one of the more left-wing members of the Shadow Cabinet is in charge of the transport portfolio. This is a Keir Starmer plan, and make no mistake about it. And it's the fact it's a Keir Starmer plan that I know, corporate affairs directors, CEOs of big companies are looking very, very carefully at precisely this plan to just work out and just think about what Labour's relationship with business is really going to look like. You listen in detail to the language used by Lou Haig, and I was very struck by one phrase, which is where she talked about the payments to shareholders, basically the dividends that are paid out to private companies who run the railways, being wasteful. That language, I think, you could find rankles people in the business world. But what Labour have been quite careful about doing is trying to control which things are dividing lines with the Tories. What's interesting about today in the railways is, as the Tories have been out and about, Mark Harper just interviewed him saying this is a bad idea. They want a dividing line. They want a public fight over this because they spy the politics of this, which you can see from positive public opinion polling, works for them. So this is one of the few fights that they want to have.
Do you enjoy a train journey, Sam? The jobs we do, we travel around the country all the time. And as a Scotsman based in London, I've taken long train journeys quite a bit. I enjoy it as a mode of transport, or at least I used to quite a lot. Some of the entertainment value has been taken out of it.
I like good train journeys and I hate bad train journeys. There is nothing worse than an overheated carriage with no Wi-Fi on a train heading south outside Stevenage because there's an unspecified blockage on the line with no updates or too many updates from the train driver for comfort, listening to somebody in the quiet carriage with their headphones blaring out and contemplating going to the restaurant carriage, which actually has run out of almost everything, and wondering whether or not it's worth the effort, given that you're going to have to walk over all of the suitcases that have been left in the middle of the aisle because the train is 3 times oversubscribed because the previous 2 trains were cancelled. So I'm less keen on those journeys, but the nice ones, yeah, sure, they're great.
Brilliant. I'll see you next time I'm getting on the sleeper, Sam. All right, take care. Thanks again.
Cheers.
Sam will, of course, be getting the bottom bunk. But let's take a little bit of time now to walk ourselves through the plan and the need for it. With Nigel Harris, former editor of Rail magazine and co-host of the Green Signals podcast. Nigel, great to have you with us.
It's great to talk to you, Neil, as ever.
I'm going to start with a big one. Is this going to work?
There is no reason why it shouldn't. I have to say, Labour has spent a long time saying nothing more than publicly owned, publicly accountable. And I've been a fairly vocal critic saying, look, you need to give us some detail. And we finally got it. And I have to say, the more I read it, the more I like it. It seems to be quite pragmatic. There is, of course, some ideological stuff in there. But my fear was that it would be totally Animal Farm ideological, if you like, private bad, public good. And it's not like that. Louise Haig's made clear that where it works, the private sector will continue to have a role, primarily in the freight market. There's the few open access operators, there's the rolling stock leasing companies, though I suspect there, Neil, their embracing of the Roscoes is down to the fabulous cost it would be to buy them out.
Just explain that point a little more, because that is something that leapt out to me, that, yeah, we are renationalising passenger services within 5 years, but in terms of the rolling stock, in terms of the things that we will be sitting in, those will still be owned by someone else.
Yeah, and I mean, that's no different to, I suppose, to aviation, is it? When you fly off on your holidays, you know, the aircraft is usually owned by a leasing company and not the airline. But it was set up. That was set up at privatisation because it was feared, quite rightly, that the train operating companies of only 7 years wouldn't be able to afford to buy trains. I think they've done a reasonable job because the investment has been incredible. We're talking about billions and billions and billions of pounds, which the railway or the government would otherwise have to come up with. But, you know, the idea of buying complete fleets, especially if we're going back into the era where the railway has to compete with education and health and everything else, it's not a bad thing. The sort of things that they've set up to commit to, which is effectively to create a boring, safe, reliable railway. And that's what we all want.
That is exactly the point I was about to make. All we want is a train service that is punctual, that is clean, that runs to time and doesn't cost the earth. Now, you've been mentioning the rolling stock companies, the Roscoes. So we've got trains that work. So why do we have a situation where pretty much everyone universally believes that right now the railway network doesn't work?
Since COVID, the passenger network collapsed overnight. All the franchises died at a stroke on March 20th when they were all told not to travel. The government converted all the franchises into operating contracts. What had been franchisees, then their relationship with the government was no different to your relationship with your decorator, your gardener. You know, you pay them a fee and they do your job, and it's just like that. The downside of that is that it has allowed the Department for Transport to absolutely micromanage the railway.
None of which is to say, though, Nigel, that there weren't problems with the railway network that predate COVID, though.
There's always been problems with the railway network. It's the biggest and most complicated machine in the world, with moving parts from Land's End to John O'Groats and Barmouth to Yarmouth, and it relies on tens of thousands of people turning up every day and doing the right thing at the right time. And it's a perfect example of chaos theory. One of the gate lines can fail at Bristol Temple Meads, and within half an hour, the suburban service around Newcastle is wrecked. So yes, there's always been problems, but you know as well as I do that having the problem isn't the problem. It's not doing anything about it that's the problem. And that's really what's happened with railways. They have not been able to let specialised people do the right thing and sort it out. And if there's one sentence in all the stuff I'm reading at the minute from Louise Haig, it's this. Labour's plans announced today will create a unified, publicly owned, accountable and arm's length body, Great British Railways, which is a crucial bit, which will be led by rail experts and not Whitehall. I cannot stress how important those few words are, because what we need is, and they've said they'll set up the same Great British Railways, which is the same body that the government said it set up 5 years ago. That body needs to be able to turn to the government and say, right, Mr. DFT, what sort of railway do you want and how much are you prepared to pay for it?
DFT, Department for Transport, of course.
And with those two questions answered, the DFT needs to go away. And then GBR needs to turn to its market, to the railways and the industry, and say, right, we've been asked for this railway at that cost, and get on with it, done by people who know what they're doing.
I'm going to mention, however, two words which used to strike fear into the heart of every commuter: British Rail. And when we had that nationalised railway service, more often than not, it wasn't running to time. The rolling stock was of low quality. I remember the sandwiches that we used to get on board. How can we guarantee that this is not just the start of a process by which we head back in that direction?
And the answer, Neil, is having the right people there. Let me give you a really good example. One of our best train operators, and by a country mile, is LNER, London North Eastern Railway, from King's Cross to York, Newcastle, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Inverness, Glasgow, the East Coast Main Line. That is part of the public sector and has been for a good few years since the franchise collapsed. And the reason why it is so good is leadership. David Horn, the managing director, really knows what he's doing. So if nationalisation means that the whole network looks like LNER, then bring it on.
Is there anything, though, Nigel, in what you're reading from Labour, from Shadow Transport Secretary Louise Haigh, that deals with the issues of capacity on the network? Of course, we've seen Rishi Sunak tear up HS2, and goodness only knows, we will find out at some point in the future, how much money has been wasted on that. But there was a necessity for an expansion of capacity in that part of the world. Is there anything in Labour's plan that seeks to plug that gap?
Well, there's nothing specific, if you like, Neil, and certainly you put your finger on what happens north of Birmingham, because within a few years that is going to be rock solid, and it's going to be a nightmare. It's just about nearly full now. The way out of this for capacity is to grow the railway. If you grow a business, you generate money you can do stuff with, you generate confidence in a government to support it, and you generate confidence in investors around it who want to be part of it. And that is something this government has not done. So going for growth is the thing to do to take the brake off what's needed to do for capacity. Electrification can follow then, or, hybrid trains, that's battery electrics, that help with emissions and everything else. Once you've got a growing railway, all is possible.
Do you think there's an opportunity here for a bit of the romance that used to be associated with this form of travel to return to the railways? I remember, for example, the first time that I got on the then newly electrified line between Ayr Station and Glasgow Central. I remember train journeys that I have taken in various parts of the world, just because the views that I had with my nose pressed up against the glass. It doesn't feel very romantic getting on a train right now.
I could not agree more, Neil. People like trains. It's the only form of transport that people stood at the side of the line wave at. You don't wave at lorries and buses, do you? If you look at LNER, again, the service that the on-train crews do is just brilliant. You've got people walking up and down with bin bags clearing up rubbish. You never saw that in BR days. There's an LNER introduced a new menu the other day. And it makes people feel a bit special. First class passengers get it complimentary, other people have to buy it. But that gloss you put around a service, which never really went around commuter services, but the long-distance services, there is every possibility of creating that gloss, and you get that halo effect generally around the railway then. But what people want, to keep going back to it, that's an extra. They want a basic, boring, reliable, safe, dependable railway at an affordable price.
Nigel, great to talk to you as always. Thanks for joining us. Stay where you are. In a moment, we head north, not on a train this time, to ask why the SNP has ended its coalition agreement with the Greens. Back soon. Welcome back. The Scottish Government has had a rough ride of late. Ongoing corruption allegations, the abandoning of key climate change targets, and now the SNP First Minister has ended his party's relationship in government with the Scottish Green Party by terminating what's known as the Bute House Agreement. Described by the SNP and Scottish Greens as a shared policy platform, but which the rest of us can easily call a coalition agreement, it meant the SNP could get their policies through. Now, Humza Yousaf serves as First Minister of a minority government. Here he is, speaking a little earlier at Butte House.
When it comes to our agreement with the Scottish Green Party, I believe that the benefits have outweighed the compromises. When I said that the agreement was worth its weight in gold, I meant it. However, it is now my judgment that the balance has shifted. The Butte House agreement was intended to provide stability to the Scottish Government, and it has made possible a number of achievements, but it has served its purpose. It's no longer guaranteeing a stable arrangement in Parliament. The events of recent days have made that clear. And therefore, after careful consideration, I believe that going forward, it is in the best interests of the people of Scotland to pursue a different arrangement. That is why, following a discussion with my cabinet this morning, I have formally notified Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater that I am terminating the Butte House agreement with immediate effect.
Our Scotland correspondent, Connor Gillies, joins us from the Scottish Parliament itself. Connor, what on earth is going on? Why has the SNP First Minister, Humza Yousaf, why has he ended what has obviously become known as the Butte House agreement?
In the last few days, there has been a lot of discussion and debate around the future of it because last week here in Edinburgh, politicians, the SNP and the Greens, ditched one of their key climate targets, essentially reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 75% by the end of this decade. That was no doubt humiliating for the Greens. The only Greens in government, we think, anywhere in the world where they were part of watering down climate commitments. And then, of course, there was the Cass report where that was examining the future, potentially, of gender identity services for children, primarily in England, but clearly there were ramifications of what that science was saying north of the border. The Greens pretty much discredited a lot of what Dr. Cass had to say in that report. It was awkward for the First Minister, but nevertheless, Humza Yousaf was defending Patrick Harvie, was defending that cooperation with the Greens and actually said it was worth its weight in gold. Fast forward 48 hours here this morning, we were all summoned to Butte House and we are told that pact has run its course, and that, critics would suggest, smacks of weak leadership from a First Minister who's not in control and pushed in to a decision that he really didn't want to make.
Allow me to be a professional cynic here for a second, Connor. I mean, isn't it just possible that Humza Yousaf is looking at the way in which the Scottish Greens have been behaving of late, looked at their comments over Cass, for example, and decided actually there might be something of an electoral liability? Or is even simpler than that? You know, Green members were going to have a vote on the Butte House agreement, weren't they? I can't see the membership of the Green Party agreeing to stay in a coalition with a party that had abandoned their key climate change targets.
Yeah, that moment last week where they abandoned those key targets was no doubt a humiliation. It put pressure on the co-leaders of the Green Party here in Scotland. It galvanised their grassroots movement. So could Humza Yousaf see the writing on the wall? Could be argued, yes, he could. Were his advisers saying you need to get on the front foot here and look like a man in control? You know, whatever he said in the last 48 hours, whether it was defending this cooperation agreement to the hilt, he's U-turned on that today because he knew probably that Green members were going to vote to scrap it anyway.
A couple of hours ago, I was thinking of asking you a question along the lines of, isn't it ironic that we have Humza Yousaf calling on the opposition parties to work with him? When you look at the press statements that they all put out in the immediate aftermath, I thought that was a little bit of a stretch for him. But actually the situation has become rather more complicated, hasn't it? Scottish Tories have launched a bid for a no-confidence vote in Humza Yousaf.
Yeah, it was a bit of a mic drop moment during First Minister's questions. Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, is lodging a no-confidence motion in Scotland's First Minister, Humza Yousaf. Let's remember, this is now an SNP government in a minority. They don't have a majority support in Parliament. They have really annoyed the Greens, who are furious at this today. How will they vote? Labour have confirmed to Sky News they will support the Conservatives in that motion of no confidence. The Liberal Democrats are following the same. There's been the defection of Ash Regan, the one-time leadership candidate for the SNP party when Nicola Sturgeon stood down. She defected to Alex Salmond's Alba party last year as well because she was angry at the direction of the Independent independence movement under Humza Yousaf. How will she vote? Will she be a kingmaker in these discussions? Could we be facing a situation where Humza Yousaf loses that no confidence vote, at which point the rules here at Holyrood state that a new First Minister must be installed within 28 days? If that's not the case, then a Scottish election is required. Could this have backfired for Humza Yousaf, who started the day trying to take control, and now we have a situation where he's out of office and facing an election?
It's often been said of Humza Yousaf that he is not quite the politician that Nicola Sturgeon was. Shouldn't he have seen this coming?
Well, his opponents say he's a lame duck leader who just 48 hours ago was defending to the hilt this deal, this pact with the Scottish Greens. Is there a suggestion that he is pulling the strings behind the scenes? Who knows? Is Stephen Flynn, the SNP Westminster leader, a man who has authority here in the room? Well, that was flatly denied by Humza Yousaf himself when I asked him that question earlier on about whether he had lost control of his authority. He said he made the decision and that is the end of the matter. Who knows what's happening behind the scenes, but it's set to get very interesting in the coming days.
Certainly is. Connor, for now, thanks very much. We are not yet at the point where Humza Yousaf's fate is sealed, but even if he survives any no-confidence chicanery, his authority has taken an awful knock. His political skills are under the microscope once again, and he'll have a hell of a time getting anything passed without the Greens on side. Stephen Flynn, the SNP's leader in Westminster, and the man many see as Humza Yousaf's replacement, might just have been keeping a close eye on Labour's railway announcement, because it might not be long before he's taking the fast train to Edinburgh. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again soon.